All right, hello and a welcome to the Gephardt Institute for Civic and Community Engagements, The Civic Moment, a special Meet the Leader series. We are so glad that you're able to join us today. My name is Genesis Steele, and I'm the coordinator for community engagement here at the Gephardt Institute. And we just like to say thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited you can be here with us, especially in the midst of our new normal. And we're glad that you are here. Also like to give a very special thanks to our staff at the Gephardt Institute for being here, starting with our director, Ms. Stephanie Kurtzman. I see our marketing team, Elizabeth is here, Colleen Smith, also our assistant director for civic engagement, Teresa Quo. So thank you so much for joining us. And also we'd like to thank the members of our National Council for joining us as well today. I believe I saw John Borline today and Claude Marks. Thank you both for being in attendance. So just before we get started, we have some quick things that we'd like to share with everybody. And what we'll be doing today after our welcome, we'll do a quick overview of the Gephardt Institute. We'll share more with you about the Meet the Leader series. Then we'll get into our featured speaker remarks from Nicholas Fandos, and then we'll conclude today's session with a question and answer session. We do want you to know, as a participant in today's presentation, it will be recorded and made available publicly following the event. We do encourage you to keep your video on and as well as your mute on so that the speaker can engage with our audience without interruptions. We ask that comments are respectful and that we encourage the dialogue to be wonderful, but please note the content will be moderated. We ask that there are no personal attacks, obscenity, profanity, selling of commercial products, endorsements of any type. And we do reserve the right to remove any inappropriate comments. Also of note, we want to be sure to encourage you to use the chat room for questions. There will be a question and answer session towards the end of our speaker remarks, so please be sure to share your questions at that time in the chat room. And a little bit more about the Gephardt Institute. So the mission of the Gephardt Institute is to foster a vibrant culture of civic engagement across Washington University, catalyzed by community engaged citizens, scholarship, and partnerships that advance the collective good. Our goals are to educate students for lifelong engaged citizenship, to catalyze community partnerships that are responsive to local community needs, and to infuse civic engagement throughout the Washington University experience. The Meet the Leader Speaker Series was launched in 2017, and it has featured a wide range of local and national leaders dedicated to civic and community engagement. The goal of our series is to highlight a variety of pathways for civic engagement and how it can be integrated into one's lifelong commitment. Since our first Meet the Leader event, we've featured over 20 prominent leaders. In our special Meet the Leader series, speakers focus in on their area of expertise through the lens of COVID on one or more of our Gephardt Institute values. And today's featured speaker, we are so thrilled to share with you, is Mr. Nicholas Fandos. Mr. Fandos is a national reporter for the New York Times based in the Washington Bureau. He has covered Congress since 2017 and is part of a team of reporters who have chronicled investigations by the Justice Department and Congress into President Trump and his administration. Over the last year, he has helped lead the Times coverage of the impeachment of Donald J. Trump and has previously reported on veteran affairs and the Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Fandos joined the Times in 2015 as an intern. He also grew up in St. Louis and went to high school just across the street from Forest Park at St. Louis University High School. He graduated with a degree in history and literature from Harvard University, where he was the editor of the Harvard Crimson. And without further ado, I present to you today our featured speaker, Mr. Nicholas Fandos.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again so much for having me. It's nice to have some digital company after a month of isolation. And I was saying earlier, nice to have a reason, even if I probably didn't need to get this dressed up, to put on some real clothing these days when nobody seems to see me at home. As Genesis said, I'm a national reporter for the New York Times, based here in Washington, D.C. That's where I am right now. Though usually I spend my days on Capitol Hill because I particularly cover Congress. For the last month or so, I have been covering Congress from my kitchen table, looking out the window, working the phones, texting old sources that I used to run into on a daily basis. So I'll talk some more about that in a little while, but I thought I could just give a little bit more introduction about my background and how I got to be in this position that I am, and then talk about the kind of two areas of interest to me, one being Congress and how it was already being strained in the Trump era, and how the coronavirus pandemic seems to be affecting it, how it's responding, stepping up to the plate, seeming to fall short, and so forth. And then I wanted to also talk about journalism, about the field that I work in, and about the New York Times in particular, where we're lucky right now to be enjoying some kind of outlier financial stability in this industry, and doing what I think and hope is a lot of important, helpful work on the pandemic. So first, just a little bit more about myself. So being a congressional correspondent for the New York Times means that I have primary responsibility with a handful of other journalists for covering basically anything that Congress, the House and the Senate, does in the name of voters and the country that may be of interest to the general public. We're not a trade publication. We're not an inside publication like Politico or Roll Call. So we tend to try and tell stories, that will affect normal people about policies and politics in a way that will have broad appeal. And so that means covering, as I just said, politics and policy. I tend to be responsible for national security issues, investigations, which have been, are always a fact of life in Washington, but have been, really up until this pandemic, kind of the chief drama of the Trump administration, beginning before he was elected with an FBI investigation into his campaign's ties to Russia, up through the impeachment trial of President Trump this year. I've spent a lot of my time focusing in on those things, but I also cover some veterans policy, as I said, national security and foreign policy a little bit more broadly. And when you cover Congress, the institutions focus on something new really every day. And so you kind of have to be a generalist in a sense that, with your fingertips on the political pulse of the country, but also, be able to get into some policy. So there are things you can feel free to ask me about as we go along. COVID so far has, I guess I'll get into this now. I mean, so that's basically what I've been doing. I was covering impeachment through the end of February, and then really had to make a pretty quick pivot because the New York Times newsroom, which is 1,700 people strong right now, has basically almost pivoted entirely to where we are all covering this issue. And I'll talk more about it later, but it's meant that we have our sports reporters have started helping cover hospitals in the hardest hit parts of the country. Culture reporters have, turned from covering the opera or the ballet or new movies to, chronicling how American culture is getting shaped as we're all, like glued to our devices like this. And for me, it's meant that, I basically have started to cover how the institution of Congress, which is an old tradition-bound, very rigid place, led not incidentally by folks who are often in their 70s or 80s, is trying to respond to the crisis and itself adapt. So it feels kind of like right now that's basically the full-time job of me and my colleagues in the Washington Bureau of the Times, where there are about 100 journalists trying to chip away at this story. So at Genesis said at the outset, I grew up in St. Louis, very fond, fond sense of having grown up there. I went to SLU High School, which is just across the park, and spent a lot of time around WashU. I left town to go to Harvard, where I studied history and literature, particularly kind of like mid 20th century American history and politics and visual art, and did not study journalism. I knew, from a pretty young age when I started getting like hooked on newspapers, first through baseball box scores, and then the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and then my parents would get the national papers delivered sometimes, the New York Times on Sundays, the Wall Street Journal during the week, that I was just kind of like, I knew that I wanted to work in journalism basically before I got to college. I thought I'd try some other things out, and that lasted for about a couple weeks, and I gave in and joined the Harvard Crimson. And the Crimson is a cool student newspaper because it's entirely student owned and operated, and prints 5 days a week. There was a printing press in the basement, and it was just I think journalism, like as pure as it can be, you can see the community that you're covering and the effect that you can have immediately, and you also have to be accountable to your community because everybody that you're writing about in a campus. I don't know if anybody on the call is involved in the student paper at WashU and knows what I'm talking about, but it was just a phenomenal experience, and I used that to get a couple of journalism internships. One at the St. Louis, erstwhile St. Louis Beacon, which became later a part of the public radio affiliate in St. Louis, the NPR affiliate, St. Louis Public Radio. But at the time was just like this great incubator of journalists from Post-Dispatch and elsewhere that, really gave me a lot of attention and interest and was engaging in the city in a really cool way with projects that were focused both on covering the news, but really on kind of civic dialogue and engagement on different issues, in some ways that may have been, ahead of their time, I think. And obviously some of that is carried over to St. Louis Public Radio. So I had a great experience doing that. And then the total opposite end of the spectrum, I did an internship with Politico, which for those of you who read it is, the kind of most insider version of journalism. They cover every turn of the screw in political life in the Capitol, and found that I really didn't want to do that. And anyway, this is all a long way of saying I got very lucky to be offered an internship and then eventually a job at the New York Times and the Washington Bureau, which is a place that when I got there was full of, I think the median age was probably 55, and I was the only person under 30. And it's grown quite a bit more diverse and young since I've been there, but has just been a place to kind of, get to saturate in some of the best journalists in the business, or to be surrounded by them. And covering government and politics, as we'll talk about, is a difficult thing with a lot of finesse and things required. So it helped kind of speed up my education in a way that I don't know that I would have had that experience elsewhere. So I think I'll talk now a little bit about Congress at this current moment, and then also about the New York Times and journalism more broadly. And then we can obviously return to anything in questioning. But I've been thinking a lot lately about, I felt since Trump was elected that basically, it's become increasingly obvious what has been the reality for the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, which is this country is just growing more and more rigidly divided along partisan lines. And I often repeated, now it seems somewhat naively, that only some sort of national crisis would be able to kind of blur those lines and scramble the dynamic in a way that we might be able to communicate with each other in ways that had not seemed to be happening, at least at the national political level and in terms of the Republican and Democratic leaders here. And so the question that I'm interested in right now, because it seems like we have that crisis, a crisis of health, economics, that are threatening, very basic things from people's, personal well-being to their financial well-being, their jobs, et cetera. Is that happening? And in particular, because I think that in the institution that I cover in Congress, partisanship has been one of the biggest drags on national governance in the last 10, 20, maybe more years. Both the House and the Senate have basically become, for other reasons, top-down or bodies where whoever is in control, whoever has the majority, is basically setting the agenda and getting to do exactly what they want to do and not what the minority party wants to do. So if the Democrats are in control of the House and the Senate, then they can enact all Democratic policies. But there's very little Republican buy-in. So inevitably, when power tips back another way, everything, the new Congress or the new White House spends its time undoing what was done by the last. And so, there's often a kind of truism in the Capitol that if you want, policy or laws that will last, you need them to be bipartisan, because otherwise the party that doesn't like them will just undo them the next time they're in. And it seems to me that this is just a very inefficient way to run a country and to set policy. I mean, it costs years and wastes a bunch of time. I think we're seeing all kinds of ways in which those policy failures and missed opportunities are exacerbating the worst of this crisis right now. So I'll be curious in the longer term to kind of track this, but I think what we've seen so far and what I've observed so far is that there have been three big kind of bills passed by Congress addressing the pandemic so far. The first one had mostly to do with testing and emergency funds and was much smaller. And then there was a kind of medium-sized bill, which was huge by any normal standards. It may have been $500 billion. We're still not sure. That had to do with healthcare and making testing more widely available and things like that. And then a third bill, which was a staggering $2 trillion, the CARES Act, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. It's the bill that is sending Americans direct payments into their bank accounts. It's the bill that's providing hundreds of billions of dollars in loans to small businesses, hundreds of billions of dollars to states and hospitals. It's just huge. And the thing about that bill is that it passed both the House and the Senate unanimously. Which, even policies, bills a tenth of that cost or with a tenth of that reach in the last 10 or 15 years have struggled to make it through on partisan lines. And you heard, Republicans and Democrats talking in kind of the first weeks of this crisis unfolding in ways that you just haven't before. I mean, we haven't in a long time. Republicans who have been very concerned about federal spending and deficits seem to set that aside and acknowledge that this is an extraordinary moment. Democrats seem to set aside some of their concerns and their mistrust of the Trump administration to be able to administer anything, and said, we are going to create these government programs and they need to go out now, and we're willing to, compromise and push all of this money out without getting everything we want. And so it does feel like there is some real opportunity in this moment for people to be thinking differently and creatively. Yet I think a question I'm really interested in following over the coming months is, can this kind of smallness in our politics meet the bigness of the moment? And will the kind of usual bickering or inability to cooperate return? I mean, Democrats continue to have a totally different ideological outlook about what role government ought to be playing in a crisis like this. They want to create new programs that will build out the social safety net. maybe tie the hands of the president, and directly intervene in Americans' lives. Republicans generally still don't like those things. They'd rather just give Americans the money so that they can spend it themselves. And those are real conflicts, and we've already started to see some of the old fighting reemerge, even just within weeks. Right now, one of the big small business programs that's giving loans has run out of money, and Democrats and Republicans can't reach an agreement about how to refill the coffers. So I think that's going to be very interesting to watch. And the other fascinating piece of it is, how does an institution that a Congress that is basically one physical building where 530 senators and members of Congress fly in and out every week from all over the country. 50% of senators are over the age of 60, a third of House members, so these are at-risk individuals. Their job is very literally often about shaking hands. How do they continue to do business at this time when gatherings of that size are not only discouraged but seem kind of crazy? And so there's discussions going on about setting up the possibility of voting from home, or holding congressional hearings from home. And I think those are things that have the potential to reshape the way that this branch of government works going forward. As for journalism, because I'm throwing a lot out there, so I'll finish on this. It seems there's this kind of horrible paradox for a lot of journalists right now, where it feels like our work is needed most to sort through the confusion of this moment, to get people the information that they need to stay safe, to navigate the federal government, and to tell the stories of people who are affected by this virus, the people who are dying, the people whose family members are dying, the people who are out of work, the people who are having to lay people off. These things feel more kind of urgent than ever, and yet the economic downturn that has come with this is already just ravaging our industry, which has been really badly suffering since the last financial crisis. And so you started to see newspapers and magazines and news organizations across the country furloughing employees, laying people off, cutting coverage. And that's a painful thing to watch. It's, as I said, part of a larger trend, but seems pretty alarming to me in this moment. The New York Times, for better or worse, has been an exception to that. I mean, there's a fair amount of guilt, I think, associated with it right now for those of us who have the privilege and responsibility of practicing journalism where we do. Part of that is because our business model has changed a lot over the last 10 years in a way that other news organizations, for one reason or another, have not pursued in the same way. We're funded largely by subscriptions now, and heavily kind of propped up by crosswords and New York Times Cooking, which maybe some of you use, that are big sources of revenue, and luckily people are using now more than ever because they're stuck at home. So we are doing all right, but I think that there is, I was on a call earlier today with our executive editor, Dean Baquet, who was saying, we are now in the middle of the story of our lifetime. And I don't think it struck any of us as odd, except for we remember 2 years ago in the kind of early days of the Trump presidency, when so much of Washington and our field was being turned over, when we were also kind of feeling basically we're in the story of our lifetime. And maybe it's the story that there are multiple stories of our lifetime happening at once. And I realize I haven't really addressed here, some of the bigger challenges of covering politics and government in the age of Trump, which I can talk more about in Q&A because, it's been uniquely difficult. But for now, I'll just say, because it's my focus, others of my colleagues are going into hospitals or going out around the world and tracking this disease. I'm helping try and sort out what the government is doing and trying to clearly convey that to readers. And a big part of our work on that right now has been trying to verify and fact check and responsibly handle information that's coming out of various parts of the government, but in particular the White House, that may not always be accurate, that may be bent to the president's point of view or to serve some political end, and trying to disentangle that. And it raises all kinds of really thorny questions about whether we should amplify everything that he says. Should we be, live streaming or broadcasting his daily press conferences? If we do, is it enough to include, written fact checks and context with it, or is it irresponsible to broadcast information that may be wrong or misleading? It's a tricky time, and it has been for a while. There's not a lot of love out there for journalists right now. Our work, depending on people's political views, can be widely mistrusted, and obviously there are those who see journalists as working against American interest. I obviously don't agree with that, and I'm happy to give a compelling defense of what we do. But that may be enough of an overview for now, and perhaps we could turn to questions, and I can elaborate on some of this stuff. Hopefully that was not too much that I just spewed out at you, but nice to be talking in these isolated times.
Well, thank you so much, Nicholas, for sharing that with us. It looks like we have a few questions. Let's see in the chat. Let's see. The first question is from, is it Janet Morgan? Janet, are you there? And if you are, would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Oops. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, Nicholas, when I listen to the press conferences as I rant and rave at the screen, as a journalist, how do you deal with having your work being marginalized and referred to as fake news? And I don't mean your work in specific. I guess I should make this just journalists in general, just because it questions what's happening within our government. I mean, how does the average person that doesn't watch multiple views like CNN and Fox and network to see that Fox isn't the only viewpoint and way of communicating what's happening? I don't know if that made sense or not.
I think so. I'll say at the outset, I wish I had a better answer than I did. I mean, this has been a multi-year struggle now for us, particularly because the president wants to, for political purposes, try and pull us into the political fray. I mean, I personally have been called an enemy of the people by the president for a story I've done, which is just, it's a really bizarre experience to have, because we, despite motivations that other people want to attribute to journalists, at least at the New York Times, we try to go into our work without political convictions, without a preconceived point that we're trying to make. I think that the best thing we can try and do is continue to walk straight ahead, to do our work, to bring a sense of history and context and expertise and transparency into what we're writing, and onto what is being said by the subjects that we cover, whether it's the president or other people. And I think generally just what I've observed personally is that engaging, kind of pushing back or taking the bait, so to speak, never serves us well. We don't really get anything out of it. And if anything, it just hurts our reputation, because it makes us look more like we're trying to fight a political fight, or we're trying to be adversarial. In a sense, journalism always is a little adversarial, because I think human nature is to want to give the most flattering account of yourself that you can. It's to convince people of your way of thinking. It's to minimize conflict and mistakes that can be made, particularly in government. So journalists are always going to be somewhat adversarial, because we are going to be pushing for the kind of inconvenient parts of your story, which are often left out. But I don't know. I wish I could tell you that we were kind of, winning the fight on behalf of truth and had made some great progress. I'm not sure we have. I feel somewhat encouraged that I think in this particular moment in our national history, there seems to be a renewed appreciation and interest and awareness of the importance of good objective journalism. Now we just need to try and make inroads out, and whether that will have to be a kind of generational change or take some other sorts of larger kind of cultural shifts. I don't know. I wish I did.
All right, so let's take a couple more questions. Let's go next with Anya, followed by John. Anya, are you here? And if you are, go ahead and unmute yourself for your question.
Hi, Nicholas. I was curious, kind of building off the last question, how, if and how you've seen partisan differences in terms of how willing people are to give you comments on stories or be sources for you on stories. Is there a difference that you see between Republicans and Democrats when you're looking for comments? And also, was that different when you were with Politico versus now with the New York Times?
That's a good question. I think there's a couple different ways to answer it. Generally speaking, in covering Congress, you don't get to Congress by not being kind of like savvy with the media and the way the country works. And, even I think if Democrats tend to identify more with the New York Times because of the policies of our editorial page and because of various cultural affinities, the Republicans that I know and work with tend to recognize the importance of the New York Times within our field and within our country. It's kind of helping set an agenda for other reporters and news organizations, for television, et cetera. And so I find that I don't find a real reluctance, except for from the far fringes, to engage with me, and I don't find it to be markedly different from, say, Democratic sources. It's often can be odd, that a Republican senator might be out on the floor, bashing this or that about the New York Times, as a kind of held up as a kind of boogeyman, and at the same time, I might be on the phone with their office getting some useful information. So it continues to function in mind-bending ways sometimes. Often, if anything, I find that Democrats tend to make faulty assumptions about my news organization being on their side, and tend to expect more positive coverage or a certain kind of understanding in our coverage that, we just don't, we're not there. That's not our job to provide, and we don't see our job that way. And so sometimes there's, there is some more friction there. And so in some ways the relationship with Republicans can be a little bit more honest because they feel like, they identify less with us for some reason or for whatever reason. And, there's a little bit more of an honest kind of reporter source expectation level. I don't know if that makes sense. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool.
All right, looks like our next question is from John. John, if you're here, can you go ahead and unmic yourself and share your question?
Hey, Nick, this is John Berline. I know your mom and dad, and I know just how proud they are of you. So keep up the good work there. My question is regards to when you go from college reporting to, for the Harvard Crimson, to the New York Times, it's kind of like going from the minor leagues to the major leagues. And I guess what I'd like to know is, what are the ins, or I guess, contrast those two for me, if you would, and then help me understand what the standards are, the lengths that the New York Times expects you to go to prevent them from being guilty of fake news.
Mm-hmm. Two good questions. I elided in my telling of my story the 2 years that I spent at the New York Times after I was an intern, being what's called a news assistant, or in the old days, copy boy or girl, though that term is out of fashion now. Where I basically was kind of an apprentice journalist, writing stories, fact checking, doing social media, sorting the mail, picking up food for meetings, all kinds of things. But still, it was a huge kind of gap. You know, the really cool thing about working on a student publication is that you get to have ownership over the whole thing. And I feel, you know, particularly where I was, Harvard is heavily invested in its public image. It has a very aggressive public affairs shop, and it's a, you know, a powerful kind of entity. And in some ways, I think that better prepared me than I knew for dealing with, you know, kind of government sources and interests, and, you know, where there's a lot of kind of image. People in government have a lot of people to manage their image and try and push around journalists. But I think a lot of the transition really, you know, and I just think this is true generally when you're getting started in journalism, it just has to do with reading a lot, and close reading stories, understanding how they work, how they're put together, where information is coming from, and then writing a lot of stories and just getting comfortable with the different types of things we do. I mean, I can write on endless different topics, but really at the end of the day, there's only about maybe 6 or 7 different story types that I write. And then you kind of fill in, you know, it's like Mad Libs in some ways. You fill in the pieces of what's new today. But I know, you know, like the back of my hand, what the structure of the story ought to look like. And so I would say it's just kind of a slow process, and often of accumulating knowledge and information and expertise. And I, by no means, have a whole lot of it, especially compared to some of my colleagues that I work with. And that can take years. And it's why I think some of the best kind of political and Washington reporters are those who have been doing it for decades. And so for me, and this will start to answer your second question, I found it incredibly important to lean on those people, to ask them, you know, who would you call if you were trying to get the backstory on this policy issue or this commission that happened 20 years ago? And, you know, oftentimes I'll have a colleague that can pull out a digital or real Rolodex and say, call these 3 people, or I wrote 10 articles on that then, or actually this is in my book. And I bring that up to answer the second question because I think, you know, the best things we can do or bring to bear to try and combat the idea of that we are fake news is, one, what I've been talking about, to kind of leave aside any obvious political motivations or agenda and leave that out of the story. Give a fair say to anybody that we quote in the story, to allow them to comment, or anybody that we're talking about in the story, allow them to comment. But I think a lot of it is about trying to find, you know, people that are the real experts on a given subject, and to be as transparent as possible about where we're getting our information. Now, in reporting on government, that's often difficult because we rely on what we call unnamed or anonymous sources sometimes to get information that, you know, officials don't really want out there. I do a lot of that in what I do, and it has to do with investigations, and that's often frustrating because I wouldn't print the information if I didn't think it's true, but it makes it harder for a reader to go and say, okay, they're attributing this to this person or these people, and I can go and figure out their track record, or, you know, understand that they put their name to it. But I think we just, I think transparency and you know, and building up a track record of expertise and being able to explain to people why, you know, we're drawing the conclusions that we're drawing. I mean, it's funny, I often find that, you know, even people that would reflexively accuse a place like the New York Times of fake news, if you can just get them to sit down and actually read a news article, they often end up coming out thinking it's pretty fair on balance, or they understand why we wrote the way we did. And, you know, I wish people obviously would read a little bit more before forming reflexive judgments. That, you know, that's out of my control, but I just got to try and, you know, be transparent with them.
Well, great answer. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
All right, we'll take the next question from Claude, then we'll get into some questions that were pre-submitted by some of our students. So we'll go Shanthi, Alicia, and Paige after Claude. Claude, if you're with us, go ahead and unmic yourself, sir.
And Nick, great presentation, and I know your folks too, and also know how proud they are of you. 2 questions for you. You're obviously very well read and well informed, and probably have strong opinions on things you write about it. How do you keep your own views out of your reporting stories, and also during the impeachment process, which was really interesting to cover. Was there ever a time that you thought the Senate might actually convict President Trump?
I'll take the second one first. Not really, though there were, I think there were some moments around the reporting that the Times was doing on what John Bolton knew and had to testify to. That before some of that was public, I had some early information on what it was going to be. And I thought there was a possibility that it might sway enough folks that there would be a real conversation about conviction or about trying to force him to resign from office. Obviously, it didn't play out that way, so it shows how good my sense is on that. It was a remarkable thing to cover because by the started out with Republicans basically denying everything that any of it was true, and ended with Republicans more or less conceding, except for the president and his legal team, conceding that the fundamental allegations against him were true, but that they either weren't wrong or weren't worthy of his being removed from office. So it's a fascinating thing to watch, kind of the shift in how people explain things to themselves. To your first question, it's, I don't know, on the one hand, it's like, it's just a matter of our training as journalism and as professionals in journalism, that you kind of check your political views at the door. So it's not hard for me to keep kind of overt political judgments out of stories. What is harder is kind of recognizing and checking your implicit bias about what might be an important topic to cover, or which viewpoint is closer to the truth or not. Sometimes it's totally obvious because one one entity is lying through its teeth and the other one can back up its facts. But oftentimes it's, in politics, it's kind of a little bit murkier. And so, I err on the side of letting people explain themselves. But we also feel pretty strongly at the New York Times that you shouldn't just say, Mr. Republican said X and Ms. Democrat said Y, you decide. If the Democrat is totally wrong, like we want to be able to as best we can guide readers to make informed decisions. It's not my decision to be making what policy is best or which candidate you should vote for, but I feel like I should give you all the information you need to do that. And I don't know, that's difficult. I'm not entirely answering your question. Part of it too is like we have many layers of editors and editing, and people come to stories with different viewpoints and different histories and practitioners, and it tends to be a nice kind of self-correcting cycle, I think. No one is ever happy though, and it tends to be that both Republicans and Democrats think that we are out to get them and that we hate them. So it's often very frustrating. My Twitter reactions I get on Twitter to almost any story I do just can be painful if I spend time to look at them. But it's part of the hazard of being in this business, I think.
All right, thank you, Claude, for that question. We'll next go to Shanthi. She pre-submitted some questions. Shanthi, if you're here, go ahead and unmic yourself for your questions today.
Hi, Nicholas. Thank you for being here. I had a question about FOIA. I don't know how often you get into FOIA fights because of congressional exemptions, but I was curious if there had been recent FOIA challenges in the midst of COVID that you could speak to, or if your colleagues were experiencing specific challenges with FOIA.
It's a very good question. I wish I had a little bit more up-to-date information than I do. I mean, the Times very often finds itself as an entity that makes a lot of FOIA requests in litigation over those. And so I don't know, a lot of the courts are really not operating right now or just beginning to operate remotely. I would guess those things are slowed down. Unfortunately, it sounds like you may do some work with FOIA. As you know, the adjudication process can be like endless. And so, you know, it's hard to tell right now whether delays are regular or whether they are extending because FOIA processors or adjudicators are working remotely and don't have access to files and things are slower. I suspect, because agencies often look for any excuse they can to slow things down, that this will, you know, in the long run begin to slow down FOIA requests. And for those that don't know, FOIA is the Freedom of Information Act, and it's basically a kind of sunshine law that allows members of the public to request information, emails, calendars, documents from the federal government to be publicly released, and then they'll get reviewed by specialists that look for kind of sensitive or classified information and that they may black out, and then they'll release them, but the process can take quite a while. I do, in my work, as you point out, there's a kind of congressional carve out, and a lot of the information, a lot of reporting I do, information I can get, Congress can get more quickly, and so I get it that way, though that's actually not always the case. You know, it was interesting during the impeachment fight, there was, the Trump administration was refusing to hand over anything to the House of Representatives in terms of documents, and outside nonprofit groups that had filed FOIAs were getting those documents that the House wanted before they were, and so they were becoming public before they ever went to Congress. But yeah, my bet is that things will slow down even further.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Oh, one other thing I'll say on that, though. I think, I mean, that touches on another issue that I'm kind of interested in, which is transparency in the response to COVID. And Congress set up a bunch of new entities during in the CARES Act and this $2.2 trillion bill to kind of police it. That will require the federal government, the executive branch, the White House, or the agencies to hand stuff over to them. So, you know, potentially that will open a door further than we're used to information as it relates to this crisis. But that obviously doesn't help on a whole host of other issues that people are interested in knowing what the government is up to. Thanks.
All right, our next student question is from, looks like Alicia Yang. Alicia, if you're there, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. All right, and if Alicia's not there, she did lead with a couple of questions for you. First question was, what do you foresee in the long term, is the long-term impact of COVID-19 to be on journalism and media?
It's another good question. I fear that the real long-term effect is going to be to expedite the erosion of the business model, the journalistic business model, which is dependent generally on a couple of things. Subscriptions. For most journalistic entities, traditionally it's been subscriptions and advertisements. There's print advertisements and online. Some, you know, bigger organizations have added live paid events, and that has generated some revenue. Some have started service journalism, you know, kind of like Consumer Reports types things. You know, podcasts. There's been different spin-offs, but really for most, and most of the kind of metropolitan dailies across the country, places like the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, they're very reliant on advertising revenue, and advertising is just, you know, it's been declining for 10 years in these kind of publications because Facebook and Google can do it for you cheaper and easier. And I fear that this is just going to accelerate that trend and potentially crash it. And you know, you could potentially be looking at a lot of magazines and a lot of newspapers that are either, you know, contracting even further into kind of their shells, or just outright going out of business. Many of them are owned by private equity firms now, which seem to just kind of, you know, be ruthlessly cutting costs at this point. And I don't see why they'd have any, you know, any particular qualms about shutting some of these kind of places down. And I don't know what will spring up. Instead, there's some vibrant nonprofit journalism, but that doesn't tend to support the same number of journalists. And so I got to say, frankly, I think, but for a handful of big kind of international news organizations now, places like CNN, NBC, Fox, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the BBC, the AP, the future is or this crisis will take a very heavy toll.
Thank you. Well, we'll wrap up our Q&A session with 2 more student questions that were pre-submitted. We'll invite Paige Sams to ask their question next. If Paige is available, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, I just wanted to know if you had any advice for students looking to go into journalism without a journalism or communications degree.
Yeah, absolutely. You're looking at one of them who has made it and succeeded so far at keeping a job. I've always, I have many colleagues who did get journalism degrees and were very well served by them. I've always felt that it's not necessary because the way you really learn journalism is by doing it and by practicing it. And, that is working on student publications. It's getting internships at small and medium-sized newspapers or magazines or websites, and just writing a lot and learning from the people around you. And the best thing you can do is just get out and do reporting and writing. And so however you can figure out to do that, whether it's an internship program or a student publication, I think you should. And then, you learn a lot, as I was saying earlier too, by closely reading, good journalism, whether it's the Post-Dispatch or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or New York Times or the New Yorker or, the Atlantic, any host of publications. That would be kind of my best advice. And when you start to get your foot in the door at a student publication, they often have connections to journalism internships, and then you build relationships there, and they can help recommend you for other internships. And it starts to ideally kind of, nicely accumulate in a way that you're learning and you can point to some prior work and open more doors. And does that answer your question? I don't know if there's other practical things you can do too, but I don't know how granular to get.
No, yes, thank you so much.
Okay, cool.
All right, and our final question we'll take from, it looks like Miss Daria. Daria, if you're still here, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, ma'am.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask about how reporters have kept safe during this time, because I actually have a reporter friend who got sick with the coronavirus, and so she's fine, but she got sick and so she couldn't work anymore. And so my question is is there any worry that in seeking to get stories from around the world, reporters and journalists themselves put others at risk because of their coverage? So I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. Thank you.
I mean, it's an odd situation for journalists to be in because we tend to want to run into, our kind of general outlook is when things go bad, journalists go in. We cover bad, unsafe situations all the time. We have reporters that live and work around the world in war zones and countries that are unsafe, et cetera. But the coronavirus has obviously created a totally new level of concern and dynamic or threat around that. So, I would normally be going to work in the Capitol every day, and I haven't been there in a month because it's a petri dish for virus. It's a place where thousands of people fly in and out every day, where under normal times tourists come through and we sit in very close quarters in poorly ventilated spaces. And, the Times has judged that I don't, it's obviously I want to be there to witness what I'm writing about under most cases, but I don't need to be there. I can do my job from my table. So that's one example. But, we are sending reporters into hospitals, into morgues, into healthcare facilities, And, the Times is a big enough organization that it has a whole kind of department that's focused on the safety of journalists. And so there's been a big effort to try and responsibly, not hoard, but procure some personal protective equipment. We've had reporters that have embedded in hospitals for a week in New York City, and it's a dangerous place to be. And so they have been outfitted appropriately. We've stopped sending photographers into people's homes. So oftentimes I'm working on a story right now on members of Congress adapting to working from home. And we ended up shooting photographs of them through Zoom in a kind of creative, odd way, where like a photo editor got on with them and composed a shot. Or in some cases, they've shot through the front door or windows to try and keep distance. So I think it's like recognizing where is it essential for us to be there in person and bear witness. And if so, and in those cases, how do we try and keep people as physically safe as possible? And if not, how can we step back and creatively do our jobs without putting people at risk? Because, we obviously would never want to carry a virus to someone or help inadvertently spread it. And so there's a lot of thinking going on around that. And I certainly have a lot of colleagues that have gotten sick. Most of them, it seems, just from living their daily lives, though in one case, a reporter who was covering kind of one of the earliest outbreak cells in suburban New York in Westchester County, was up there, spent a week in the town of New Rochelle, and she ended up getting COVID, and luckily it was a mild enough case that she's recovered now and is okay. But it's just a reminder that there are risks to it, but that's how we're trying to mitigate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you to all for joining us today. This officially concludes our formal time with our featured speaker, Mr. Nicholas Fandos. And we'd like to thank everyone for attending again. Thank you to our Gephardt Institute staff members, our National Council members, our students, our WashU community, and our community members at large. We really appreciate you for being with us today. And I have one more slide for you. Just to share, and if you can take a moment and help us out by taking a picture of this QR code, it will link you to a survey that will help us evaluate our Meet the Leader sessions, and it will provide us with valuable feedback. And while you're doing that, please know that we do have one more special Meet the Leader series that will be next Friday. And our featured speaker will be Shana Goodman, who is the Director of Policy for Reproductive Health and Rights for the National Partnership for Women and Families. You can find out more about Shana and about what we do at the Gephardt Institute by going to our website, which is www.gepardtinstitute.wustl.edu. And for those who are able to stay around for just a little bit longer, feel free to do so, but we do understand that there may be some that have to log out now. And we wish you a wonderful afternoon full of peace, prosperity, love, and safety, and thank you so much for joining us today.